When I picked up Molly Davidson on that Sunday evening, I was just trying to make extra money to pay off crushing medical debt from my wife's cancer treatments. I never expected her water to break in my taxi or that I'd end up rushing her to the hospital for an emergency delivery. What happened when her husband, Dr. Marcus Davidson, tracked me down the next day with a mysterious envelope would prove that sometimes one act of kindness can solve problems you thought were impossible to overcome. Hi everyone, welcome to Life's Changing Stories. Now, let's dive into today's story. The Miami heat shimmered off the asphalt as Brian Thompson adjusted his rearview mirror and checked his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. At 34 years old, Brian had been driving taxis through the sprawling streets of South Florida for over a decade, but today felt different. Sundays were usually his day off, time to help his wife Carmen with household chores, take his two daughters to the park, and pretend for a few hours that financial stress wasn't consuming his every waking thought. But here he was, cruising down Biscayne Boulevard at 6:30 p.m. on a Sunday evening, because the stack of unpaid medical bills on his kitchen table had left him no choice. Carmen's breast cancer treatments had been successful, thank God, but the aftermath had buried their family under an avalanche of debt that seemed to grow larger every month, despite his best efforts to chip away at it. Brian's 2015 Honda Accord had been converted into a taxi 3 years earlier, when his construction job disappeared during an economic downturn and he needed income fast. What started as a temporary solution had become his full-time profession, though he'd discovered an unexpected satisfaction in the work. Unlike the toxic office environments he'd experienced in his 20s, driving a taxi meant being his own boss, setting his own schedule, and having the flexibility to attend his daughter's school events and help Carmen with her ongoing recovery. Most days, Brian followed a predictable routine. Wake at 5:30 a.m., help Carmen prepare breakfast, and get 8-year-old Sophia and 6-year-old Isabella ready for school, drop them off personally, then spend the day navigating Miami's chaotic traffic while carrying passengers to their destinations. He typically worked until 3 o'clock p.m., took a 1-hour break to decompress and grab lunch, then returned to the streets until dinner time. Brian genuinely enjoyed connecting with people during their brief rides together. Miami's diverse population meant every day brought conversations in multiple languages, stories from different cultures, and glimpses into lives completely unlike his own. Some passengers were tourists discovering the city for the first time. Others were locals dealing with car troubles or avoiding the expense of parking downtown. Each fare represented not just income, but a small human connection in an increasingly disconnected world. However, the reason Brian was working this particular Sunday evening wasn't routine. It was desperation. A collections notice had arrived in Friday's mail, threatening legal action if a significant payment wasn't received within 10 days. The debt from Carmen's chemotherapy and radiation treatments had ballooned to nearly $47,000, despite their insurance coverage and payment plans they'd negotiated with the hospital. Brian had been making modest monthly payments for 2 years, but the outstanding balance seemed to regenerate faster than he could reduce it. As he drove through Coral Gables, scanning for potential passengers, Brian's mind wandered to his daughter's upcoming school expenses and Carmen's follow-up medical appointments. The constant financial pressure had created a background stress that affected every decision, from grocery shopping to planning family activities. Brian worked harder than ever, but it felt like running on a treadmill, constant motion without meaningful progress. At 7:15 p.m., while stopped at a traffic light near the University of Miami campus, Brian spotted a young woman standing on the sidewalk, clearly pregnant and struggling with several heavy shopping bags. She appeared to be in her late 20s, wearing a bright blue maternity dress, and looked uncomfortable in the humid evening heat. When she raised her hand to signal for a taxi, Brian immediately pulled over to help. "Thank you so much," the woman said, as Brian got out to assist with her groceries. "These bags are heavier than I expected, and I'm not supposed to be lifting anything this heavy anymore." "No problem at all," Brian replied, loading the bags into his trunk. "Where can I take you?" "Pinecrest, please. Kendall Drive near the town center," she said, settling carefully into the back seat. "I'm Molly Davidson, by the way. I really appreciate this." "Brian Thompson," he responded, adjusting his mirrors and pulling back into traffic. "When are you due?" "Any day now, actually," Molly laughed, patting her rounded belly. "My doctor says I'm officially full-term as of yesterday." "My husband keeps telling me I shouldn't be out running errands alone. But I feel fine, and I wanted to stock up on groceries before the baby arrives." As they drove through the early evening traffic, Molly's phone rang. Brian could hear a man's voice on the other end, clearly agitated about something. Molly's responses were calm and reassuring, though Brian tried not to eavesdrop on the conversation. "Marcus, I'm fine, I promise," Molly said into her phone. "I just picked up some groceries, and I'm in a taxi heading home now." "You worry too much, sweetheart. I'm like Wonder Woman. I can handle these little things." After a pause, she added, "I love you too. I'll see you in 20 minutes. After ending the call, Molly sighed and smiled at Brian through the rearview mirror. "My husband is a little overprotective right now. He's a resident at Jackson Memorial Hospital, so he sees worst-case scenarios all day long. He thinks I should be on bed rest, but I feel great, and I want to be useful while I still can." "He's just doing what every expectant father does," Brian replied. "It means he loves you and wants to make sure you're both safe." "Do you have other children?" "This is our first," Molly said, her voice filled with excitement. "We found out we're having a girl. Marcus calls her Daddy's little princess, even though she's not born yet. He's been reading parenting books for months and practicing diaper changes on a doll." She laughed at the memory. "What about you? Do you have kids?" "2 daughters," Brian said proudly. "Sophia is 8 and Isabella is 6. They're the reason I work as hard as I do. Everything I do is for them and my wife Carmen. They're lucky to have a dad who cares so much," Molly said warmly. "I hope our daughter grows up knowing her father loves her the way you obviously love your girls." As they approached Molly's neighborhood, Brian felt a sense of satisfaction from the pleasant conversation. Interactions like this reminded him why he enjoyed driving a taxi despite the financial stress it represented. Every passenger had a story, and sometimes those brief connections provided perspective on his own challenges. "It's the blue house with the white fence," Molly directed as they turned onto Kendall Drive. "Right here is perfect." Brian parked in front of a modest but well-maintained 2-story home with a small front garden and a white picket fence. As he got out to retrieve Molly's groceries from the trunk, she carefully maneuvered herself out of the back seat, one hand supporting her lower back. "Let me help you with these bags," Brian offered, lifting the groceries and following Molly toward her front gate. That's when everything changed. As Molly reached for the gate latch, she suddenly stopped moving and looked down at her feet with an expression of shock and confusion. A puddle of clear fluid had appeared on the sidewalk beneath her, and her face went pale as she processed what was happening. "Oh my God," Molly whispered, looking at Brian with wide eyes filled with sudden panic. "I think the baby is coming. My water just broke." Brian immediately set down the grocery bags and helped steady Molly, who was beginning to breathe heavily and appeared overwhelmed by the situation unfolding so rapidly. "Okay, we need to get you to the hospital right now," Brian said, his own adrenaline beginning to surge as he recognized the urgency of the situation. "Can you walk back to the car?" "I think so," Molly nodded, though her breathing was becoming more labored. "Jackson Memorial is about 15 minutes from here." Marcus is working tonight, so he'll be there when we arrive. Brian helped Molly back into the taxi, this time in the back seat, where she could lie down if necessary. He grabbed a clean towel from his emergency kit and placed it on the seat for her comfort. As he started the engine and pulled away from her house, Molly was already experiencing her first contractions. "Brian, I need you to drive fast," Molly said, her voice strained with pain. "These contractions are coming really quickly. I don't think we have much time." "Hold on, Molly," Brian said, activating his hazard lights and pressing the accelerator. "We're going to get you there safely. Just focus on breathing and try to stay calm." The 15-minute drive to Jackson Memorial Hospital felt like the longest journey of Brian's life. Miami's Sunday evening traffic was light, which allowed him to maintain higher speeds while navigating safely through intersections and around slower vehicles. Molly's contractions intensified during the drive, and she gripped the door handle while breathing through waves of pain. "You're doing great," Brian called back to her, frequently checking his rearview mirror while maintaining focus on the road. "We're almost there. Just a few more minutes." "I can see the hospital," Molly said with relief as the towering medical complex came into view. "Brian, I can't thank you enough for this. If you hadn't been there—" "Don't worry about that now," Brian interrupted, pulling into the emergency entrance and immediately running around to help Molly out of the car. "Let's get you inside." A nurse at the emergency entrance saw them approaching and immediately called for a wheelchair. Molly was clearly in active labor, and the medical staff recognized the urgency of the situation. As they transferred her into a wheelchair, Molly grabbed Brian's hand. "Wait," she said breathlessly between contractions. "I need you to know how grateful I am. You saved us today." "You're going to be fine," Brian assured her, squeezing her hand gently. "Remember what you told your husband. You're Wonder Woman. You've got this." The medical team wheeled Molly into the hospital while Brian returned to his taxi to move it from the emergency entrance. Before leaving, he gathered Molly's purse, phone, and groceries from his car and brought them to the hospital reception desk, making sure they would reach her room once she was settled. The emotional impact of the experience stayed with Brian as he continued working for the rest of the evening. He found himself thinking about Molly and her baby, hoping everything had gone smoothly and that her husband Marcus had been able to be present for the delivery. The incident reminded him of Sophia and Isabella's births and how those moments had changed his perspective on what truly mattered in life. When Brian arrived home around 10:30 p.m., Carmen and the girls were still awake, eager to hear about his day. Over late dinner, he recounted the story of helping Molly get to the hospital, emphasizing how important it was to help people in need, regardless of the circumstances. "Did the baby come out okay, Daddy?" Isabella asked with the innocent curiosity of a 6-year-old. "I don't know yet, sweetheart," Brian replied, "but I'm sure the doctors took very good care of both the mommy and the baby." "You're a hero, Daddy," Sophia declared matter-of-factly. "That lady was lucky you were there to help her." Carmen smiled at their daughter's reactions, then looked at Brian with the expression of pride and love that had sustained him through their most difficult financial challenges. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "You did the right thing." The next morning, Brian followed his usual routine, helping Carmen prepare breakfast, taking Sophia and Isabella to school, then beginning his workday around 8 a.m. The Miami morning was already warm and humid, promising another scorching day ahead. Brian's first few fares were routine: an airport pickup, a businessman heading to a downtown meeting, an elderly woman going to a medical appointment. Around 10:15 a.m., while dropping off a passenger at a shopping center in Coral Gables, Brian noticed a man on a motorcycle in his rearview mirror. The rider had been following his taxi for several blocks, maintaining a consistent distance that suggested intentional tracking rather than coincidental travel in the same direction. After his passenger exited and paid the fare, Brian pulled into a parking space to see what the motorcyclist wanted. The man immediately parked nearby and removed his helmet, revealing a young man in his early 30s wearing hospital scrubs beneath a leather jacket. "Excuse me," the man called out as he approached Brian's taxi. "Are you Brian Thompson?" "Yeah, that's me," Brian replied cautiously, wondering how this stranger knew his name and why he'd been following him. "Is everything okay?" "My name is Dr. Marcus Davidson," the man said, extending his hand with a warm smile. "My wife Molly asked me to find you. You helped her get to the hospital last night when she went into labor." Brian's face immediately brightened with recognition and relief. "Dr. Davidson, how are Molly and the baby? I've been thinking about them since last night." "They're both perfect," Marcus replied, his smile widening. "Healthy baby girl, 7 pounds 3 ounces. Molly had a quick delivery. She was only in labor for about 2 hours after you brought her in. The timing was crucial, and if you hadn't been there to help her..." "I'm just glad everything worked out," Brian interrupted, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "I thought about stopping by the hospital to check on them, but I wasn't sure if that would be appropriate." "Actually, Molly would have loved to see you," Marcus said. "She's been talking about you non-stop since the delivery. She wanted to thank you personally, but she's still recovering and the baby needs constant attention." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a white envelope. "She asked me to give you this. It's our way of saying thank you for what you did yesterday." Brian immediately shook his head and held up his hands. "Dr. Davidson, you don't need to do this. I just did what anyone would have done in that situation. What's important is that Molly and your daughter are healthy and safe." "Please," Marcus insisted, holding out the envelope. "Molly really wants you to have this. She said you were her guardian angel, and she's not the type of person who forgets kindness like yours. If she could be here to give this to you herself, she would be." Reluctantly, Brian accepted the envelope, touched by the gesture, even though he felt uncomfortable receiving payment for helping someone in an emergency. "Thank you," he said. "Please tell Molly that I'm thinking about her and the baby, and that I hope your family is very happy together." "I will," Marcus promised, putting his helmet back on. "Take care, Brian, and thank you again for everything." As Marcus drove away on his motorcycle, Brian sat in his taxi, holding the unopened envelope. He could tell it contained more than just a thank you card. There was definitely something substantial inside. With trembling hands, he carefully opened it and looked inside. Brian's eyes filled with tears as he stared at the contents of the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $50,000, along with a handwritten note from Molly that read, "Brian, Marcus and I can never fully express our gratitude for what you did. When I saw you helping with my groceries, I knew you were a good person. When you stayed calm and got me to the hospital safely, I knew you were special. This comes from both our hearts. Please use this to take care of your family the way you took care of mine. With love and eternal gratitude, Molly and Marcus Davidson." Brian sat in his parked taxi, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't fully process. The amount of money in his hands was enough to eliminate his family's medical debt completely, with enough left over to create a small emergency fund for the first time in years. The crushing financial pressure that had dominated every aspect of his life for the past 2 years could be gone by the end of the week. As he drove home to share the news with Carmen, Brian reflected on the lesson he wanted to teach Sophia and Isabella about kindness and helping others. He had helped Molly because it was the right thing to do, not because he expected any reward. The fact that his simple act of human decency had resulted in such life-changing generosity felt like proof that goodness still existed in the world. Brian understood that doing good deeds didn't always come with rewards. Most acts of kindness went unrecognized and unrewarded. But sometimes, when you least expected it, life demonstrated that caring for others created ripples that could transform everything. The envelope in his passenger seat represented not just financial relief, but validation that the values he was trying to instill in his daughters, compassion, service, and treating strangers with dignity, actually mattered. When Brian walked through his front door that afternoon, Carmen immediately knew something extraordinary had happened. The stress lines that had been etched around his eyes for months were gone, replaced by an expression of joy and wonder she hadn't seen since before her cancer diagnosis. "What happened?" Carmen asked, studying her husband's face. Brian told her the entire story, from picking up Molly the previous evening to Marcus tracking him down that morning with the envelope. When he showed Carmen the check and Molly's note, they both cried tears of relief, gratitude, and disbelief that such kindness existed. "This is why I married you," Carmen whispered, holding Brian tightly, "because you're the kind of person who stops to help a pregnant woman with her groceries without thinking twice about it." That evening, as they explained to Sophia and Isabella how their father's kindness had changed their family's future, Brian emphasized that the most important part of the story wasn't the money. It was the reminder that small acts of caring for others could create unexpected miracles. "The most important thing," Brian told his daughters, "is that we helped someone when they needed help. The fact that Molly and Dr. Davidson chose to help us in return is a blessing, but it's not why we do good things. We help people because it's right, not because we expect rewards." 3 months later, Brian received a birth announcement with a photo of Molly, Marcus, and their daughter Isabella Marie Davidson, named partially in honor of Brian's youngest daughter. The family had moved to a larger home in preparation for Isabella Marie's arrival, and the photo showed them looking radiant and healthy. Brian continued driving his taxi, though with the financial pressure removed, he was able to reduce his hours and spend more time with his family. The experience had reinforced his belief that his work connecting with people throughout Miami was valuable and meaningful, regardless of the income it provided. Carmen's medical follow-ups continued to show no signs of cancer recurrence, and the family was able to establish a savings account for the first time in their marriage. Sophia and Isabella grew up hearing the story of how their father's kindness had transformed their lives, learning that character and compassion were more valuable than any material possessions. The story of Brian and Molly became a reminder that in a world often focused on individual success and personal advancement, the simple act of caring for strangers in their moments of need could create connections that transcended economic status, professional backgrounds, and social circumstances. Sometimes the most profound changes in life came not from achieving personal goals, but from recognizing opportunities to serve others and having the courage to act on those opportunities without calculating the potential benefits to yourself. We hope you enjoyed today's story of love, life, and betrayal. For more free stories and entertainment from our channel, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe with notifications.